I'm back. Welcome to Chapter 5, the structure and function of macromolecules. I think you'll like this chapter. This is part 1. Hopefully we can get all this in 2 parts. This first part will just kind of be a little bit of an introduction, and we'll talk about one of the macromolecules. I think you'll like this chapter. It's primarily dealing with 4 major macromolecules that are found in living things, and a lot of these are the food that you eat. So I think you'll like that part of it. You'll find about a little bit of information about some things that you eat, and some of it's kind of interesting. So there's 4 main classes of these large biomolecules. The first one you're familiar with, carbohydrates. You know, everybody's favorite. Everybody loves to eat bread, and especially your sweets and all your sugars, and so those are all fit into grain as well, fit into this category of carbohydrates. The next thing that we will talk about in the second part, we won't get to it today, is on lipids, and lipids are fats and oils and things like that. Then proteins, really good for you. Proteins are your building blocks of really, but pretty much what you're made up of. When you look in the mirror and you see yourself and your pretty face, and you're looking at all basically proteins. So, and then the last one is the one that really defines who we are, is our nucleic acids, and those are your DNA and RNA, so kind of the blueprints that makes you what you are, and those blueprints are actually what builds the proteins, and you'll learn all about that later, more than you want to learn, probably. All right, to start us off here, let's talk about polymers. Polymers, so what is a polymer? You've probably heard of that term before. You might not know exactly what it is, but it's kind of it's kind of a general term, and we'll talk about polymers and monomers and things like that, but a polymer is just a long molecule that consists of several similar types of building blocks, and those building blocks that we're referring to are actually called monomers. Those are kind of the single unit, whereas polymers are all these multiple several of these single units added together forms the polymer. And so we will talk about specific polymers and monomers in some of these different macromolecules. Now, there's a couple of things you need to know. We need to talk about how these polymers are formed and how they are broken down. So the first thing we want to talk about is how they are formed. So if you look at this picture here, and let's take a look at this picture. Okay, so we have, now there's a couple of terms that, there's a term that specifically you're going to need to familiarize yourself with. It's in Chapter 4. I will mention it in class. We'll talk about it, but I'll go ahead and mention it here again. And it's this right here. You see it's an HO, and oftentimes that is actually, usually it's either written as an HO like this or an OH, and that is actually called a hydroxyl group. Okay, it's a hydroxyl group. And it's a functional group that the Chapter 4 talks about. We're not going to go into those a whole lot of detail. Some of them you need to be familiarize yourself with. So let's first of all talk about this dehydration synthesis. Your book also refers to it as a condensation reaction. And it's kind of, those two terms dehydration should be the key term to help you understand that. So when you dehydrate, if you get too hot and you dehydrate, what are you losing? You're losing too much water, right? So that's what a dehydration synthesis is you're taking a water molecule, notice right here, taking a water molecule out, and when you take this water molecule out, you add 2 molecules together. Okay, so you're combining these 2 molecules and forming this one polymer here, and you're doing so by taking a water molecule out. And actually what happens here is you take a hydrogen from one of the molecules right here and a hydroxyl group from another molecule, and there's your 2 hydrogens and your oxygen, and those together will form a water molecule. And whenever they do so, it combines these 2 separate ones together, and the energy is required to do this too. So make sure you understand that. So you can see right here, energy is required to form these bonds together between these 2 different monomers. So that's a dehydration synthesis. Again, that's how polymers are formed. Now polymers are broken down if you look down here, but just the opposite. It's quite simple here. is if you have this polymer right here, okay, you see this polymer, when you add water to it, what does it do to it? One hydrogen is going to go to this molecule, and a hydrogen and the oxygen, or a hydroxyl group, is going to come to this molecule. And so you have two separate molecules. You've basically split this one polymer into two. That plays a key role, and again, I guess I should mention what it's called. It's kind of hard to see down here at the very bottom. It's called hydrolysis. Okay, it talks about it in your book, and that kind of makes sense when you're putting water into it. It's hydrolysis is splitting that molecule, and that's going to play a big role in some of the metabolic processes. Actually, both of these will, but especially this one down here when we talk about cellular respiration. And again, cellular respiration is how your body breaks food down for energy. So at the cellular level, when you're dealing with all these tiny little monomers or polymers, I should say, your body needs to break those down for energy, and they break these bonds, and when it does so, it's going to release energy, and that's called hydrolysis. We'll talk more about that later. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, let's talk about carbohydrates. Of course, when we think about carbohydrates, you probably think about this. You think about your croissants and your rolls and your biscuits and donuts and all that. But we're going to think more of it at this level. Doesn't this look fun? These are the structural components of these carbohydrates. There's three main types that we're going to be dealing with. There's a simple carbohydrate right here. These are your monosaccharides. Mono, think about one. And these are your glucose, galactose, fructose, or some of the other ones. And over here you have disaccharides. Just as the name implies, the word di means two. So these are basically going to be two of your monosaccharides linked together. And they're linked together by this bond called a glycosidic linkage. And that is in your book. Just for time's sake, I'm not going to spell that out, but it is in your book on page 70, glycosidic linkage. And then a complex carbohydrates down here are your polysaccharides. And this is where the word poly means many, so you're going to have many of these monosaccharides together. So again, these are the three main types of carbohydrates. Let's go ahead and talk about polysaccharides in a little more detail. Polysaccharides are, there's a couple different types your book talks about. The first one is a storage polysaccharide. Now this storage one, there's two main types. There's starches, which I'm sure you're familiar with. You know we find starches in foods, and it's basically a storage of energy for these plants. And they can store that and use that later on. A lot of times plants will store a lot of energy in their roots, and they store those for whenever they need energy later on, especially during the winter time. And we can also benefit from the starch that's found in plants, so grains and such. And we can hydrolyze those starches just fine and get energy from those ourselves. Now, one that doesn't get as much playtime is this thing called glycogen. Glycogen is a storage that's very similar to starch, but it's found in animals. It's mainly found in liver and muscle cells, but it's kind of the same thing. It's kind of a quick little storage for energy, and it doesn't last real long. About a day supply is about all you have, but it's a good place for energy storage. The last one here is the structural polysaccharide that we're going to talk about, and the main one we're going to talk about is cellulose. Cellulose is the main component of cell walls in plants, and of course the cell wall is what surrounds the plant cell. And your book talks about how there's about I think it's 100 billion tons of cellulose globally around the world. And they say it's the largest carbon-containing compound on Earth. So there's so much of the cellulose everywhere. Interesting thing about cellulose, there's two forms of it. Real quick, we're trying to get through this. I'm kind of running out of time. There's two forms of it. You have what we call an alpha glucose over here and a beta glucose over here. The alpha, there's a couple differences. If you notice the alpha here, the hydroxyl group is pointing down, and on the beta, the hydroxyl group is pointing up. And that plays a big role. In starches, if you'll notice, all these monosaccharides are linked together by these alpha monomers. And so they're all on the bottom here, okay? So as humans, we don't have any problem at all hydrolyzing these. But when you get over here to these beta glucose monomers, what it does is it puts every other one facing up. Notice this one right here is how it's facing up. These are your beta glucose monomers. And we have really a difficult time hydrolyzing that. I'll talk about that in just a second. Now, it's very important to understand, your book talks about this, that these cellulose fibers, if you'll notice here in this picture, that this is showing you cellulose, and because they have these beta glucose in them, and these hydroxyls are on the top and they alternate, there's actually there's a hydrogen bond. If you see these little hydrogen bonds between the OH here and the OH there, hydrogen bond from the OH here and the OH here. So that form makes this really strong. That's why the wood is so strong in plants, and it's in those cell walls, and it's very beneficial for plants, also beneficial for us when we're building houses, things like that. So let's move on here to the next one. And the last thing we want to talk about, I mentioned earlier that we can't really, as our humans, we can't really do much with those beta monomers in glucose. So we can't hydrolyze them. And I like to one way to help you remember this is we can't digest cellulose, since we really can't do anything with it. And it is beneficial for us to some extent because it's basically insoluble fiber, so it's kind of good for the plumbing, if you know what I mean. It gets things flowing, and it keeps you regular. Now, one thing about it I do want to mention, a lot of times corn has a lot of cellulose in the kernels and in the walls of the cellulose. And so what I want to leave you with for this first part here is just this thought, and probably something you didn't know about. But if you've ever wondered, when you eat corn, you really can't digest it. You can't digest those corn kernels because of that cellulose in the wall. So there's a very good chance that you'll probably see that corn again the next day. So I'll leave it at that. I'll let you think about what I'm talking about there, and I'll let you figure that out. And hopefully you'll have got something out of this, and I will see you in part 2.